Good evening. Welcome to the Word and Journey podcast, stories that shape us and make us think and become part of our traditions. And some of them invariably become part of our education as well, such as in the classics. We're talking about a classic this evening. As the date of this recording is December the 27th, just after the Christmas holiday, Nativity holiday, and it was a great holiday. I don't know how to quantify these things. I mean, I saw my family. We got sick. We got better in time to go to church, and things were good. We kept it kind of simple. It was nice. I'm talking stories because that's what the show was all about, and talking about A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. This was briefly mentioned in the first ever compilation episode I did. Perhaps you've seen it, the holiday stories we've loved and lived. I got together a whole bunch of prior guests from the show, and we talked about our favorite stories, some stories related to the holidays that we really appreciate. And it was a mix of very silly stories and very profound stories and some very personal stories. It was an interesting observation for me about how I asked people, "Hey, what's one of your favorite holiday stories?" What in any medium, in my head thinking, books, movies, you know, White Christmas, It's a Wonderful Life, The Gift of the Magi, etc. And it was interesting seeing how very naturally and instinctively people gravitate toward also talking around their own personal stories and how our personal life is very closely intertwined with the stories that we tell ourselves. An interesting observation. And again, just thinking again about the importance of story and the importance of reading and taking in good stories that make us think, because the stories we take in become part of us. So good stories are essential things. Anyway, so this season I read the novel A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens to mostly to my older son, but who's 9, and but my 6-year-old started tagging along more and more by the end, and he was getting into it. And A Christmas Carol is a fun one. So it's a story I've known the story since I was a little kid. I was The first version I took in, I think, was Mickey's Christmas Carol, with Mickey Mouse as Bob Cratchit and Scrooge McDuck and Goofy as Jacob Marley, et cetera, et cetera. So much fun. There were other movie versions I took in. There was a Muppet Christmas Carol. You just can't not can't not know and appreciate that one. Anyway, but this was the first time I'd actually read the full story, and turns out it's not actually a very long story. It's sort of it's probably a little bit too long to be technically a short story, but definitely a novella. Nice, peaceful little read. We split it up over 6 or 7 nights, I think, altogether. So I'd highly recommend the reading experience. It was fun as well because I'm very accustomed to modern writing style, a lot of first person voice, a lot of wordsmithing, a lot of creative writing, and so stepping into 1800s England, written by hand, originally British humor, British flair, is a good exercise for me as a reader, as a vocal reader is a really great exercise to just be in a different genre, different time period. So very very healthy in that regard. But what I wanted to emphasize, there's a whole lot of really cool things in the story, a lot of themes. My counselor brain, will definitely notice. And I'm not going to like emphasize this in this episode. This is worth more time, but it stood out very much as Ebenezer Scrooge, this very classic miserly character, hates Christmas, hates everybody, lives alone. Uh, what I love about the structure of the story, there's the three spirits: Christmas past, Christmas present, Christmas future. You really get the sense of he didn't end up this way by accident. I mean, you go into his past, you see he's this neglected kid, and neglect is a form of abuse, and so he's all alone. He's got attachment failure. He's having to adapt to being rejected. He's being rejected by his dad, and he doesn't have close companionship, and so his adaptation ultimately is to pour himself into the relationship that's available, and that's to money, that's to work. And so that becomes his primary attachment, and it supersedes other relationships for years and years, and we get to see some of the fallout of that. But it was a really nice, just gentle presentation of people have a context, and even the miserable people, the people that are harsh and mean and miserly and like cruel and harmful in the world, they come from somewhere. They come from some sort of pain, and again in the flow of the story, for Scrooge, he's wounded in these rejection relationships and ultimately healed and coming back into relationship, and it's just like a really beautiful symmetry thing there too. But what I was most interested in this time was uh, the way Scrooge's life almost resembles an ascetic practice, almost. Uh, so this, it's talked about in the book, especially before he meets Jacob Marley, and goes on his adventure. He's coming home to this was a big house, but he's this empty house. He doesn't use very much light, doesn't use very much heat, doesn't eat very much. We watched one of the older movie versions of this. I think it's the one with George C. Scott, if I remember the actor's name right. Really great, just classic 80s film. But the film captured this in a really cool way, because it's showing it. In Scrooge, he's come home from work. He's going to be just alone for the holidays, and there's this image of him holding his little bowl of gruel, and it's like this little simple soup or something. That's his meager meal, and he's got his little candle lit and his tiny little fire, and he's going to go to bed in the sheets just all by himself, or this really 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 simple life. And it was interesting for me watching that, because in in Orthodox Christianity, one uh, trademark of this tradition is its rich monastic tradition. There's a really strong, vibrant presence of monks and nuns, and there always has been since second, third, fourth century. There's always been the ascetics, and that's part of how their spiritual practice is. It's a major part of it. They renounce the world. They renounce pleasures. They you know it's talked about as spiritual athleticism. Their feats of fasting, of almsgiving, of sexual abstinence, sexual renunciation. That's certainly part of it. But not just those things too. There's you get these ascetics who live for years outside in the cold. They have the stylites. They're a little on the extreme side, but the ones that live on top of pillars, the ones that live up in trees. There's the cell dwellers, who like live in a little cave or in a little room for years and years. Saint Denis of St. Petersburg, wandering around the streets of Russia in Russian winter with like very little to keep her warm and no food, and she's just she's just out there in the weather. And so you get you get this theme in Orthodox monasticism of really simple life, really bare bones, um, not eating very much, not eating very simple food when they do, like bread, maybe some grapes, like a little bit of meat here and there, but like really, really simple diets, really simple clothing, really, they renounce, possessions and belongings and everything. And that's oftentimes a feature of the monastics, and whether they're more hermits or more in a small skeet, or whether they're in the monasteries, that tends to be a thing. So it was interesting for me now watching this depiction of Ebenezer Scrooge, and he's this character who also lives very simply. Granted, he is rich, so that's a thing. That's a consideration. He's rich. He has this big house. He doesn't dress fancy. He doesn't do frivolous things. He doesn't eat very much. He doesn't eat fancy. He doesn't play. He's single and presumably abstinent also. I mean, I'm inferring something there, but um, so there's some traces of asceticism in his life. But what's the difference? Because he's clearly not a monk, and we would, I think, look at him and say, uh, we wouldn't recognize his lifestyle as asceticism. We tend to recognize this character pretty quickly as he's a miser, and the way that he lives is not good, not healthy for him. So what's the difference? What's the difference between Scrooge and a monk? Um, you know, I mean, he doesn't he's not tonsured. He doesn't wear the robe. He's not part of the church. He's not part of a tradition. That's a major component. There is the issue of, he hasn't actually renounced wealth. He's hoarding it. He's guarding it. He's drawn. You could presume Scrooge is drawing his security from his wealth, even as he sort of scorns it and doesn't use it. Doesn't, like in the story, his nephew Fred points out, like, his wealth isn't benefiting him. He's not doing anything with it. He's certainly not giving it to us. He's not giving it to anyone else. He's not having fun with it or anything. It's just there. So there's that. And we see in Scrooge, he's not a generous character. He's not in community. He's not striving for character growth. He's alone. He's alone. He's hoarding his wealth. He's not progressing in any way. He's not. There's no sense of doing this for spiritual gain. It's just for the money, for the hoarding. And so there is yeah. So there's a difference there, um, and I'm really thinking about how he's just this very disconnected individual, disconnected from any beliefs, any tradition, any sense of feasting or fasting. Um, there's no almsgiving, there's no generosity, there's no kindness. That's nothing he does is driven by compassion. Whereas with good healthy monastics, what they do is driven by compassion. Love for the Lord Jesus, love for humankind, love for others in the community. They're driven by kindness. They're very generous. They have given away their belongings, their possessions. They don't accumulate wealth. Um, Granted, I mean, you'll see a lot of monasteries are very beautiful places. It's because they accumulate donations and they invest in their spot. They cultivate beauty around them through gifts that they are given over the years, and then that's a thing. So that's a thing there, and it's also a thing and we see in Scrooge's life too. He's not cultivating anything beautiful. He's just this very dark and drab life. So he's a dynamic character. He goes on a very interesting, powerful character growth arc throughout the story, and so by the end of it, he does actually, I think, begins to approach something like um something like what a more true asceticism would be. Uh, this isn't in the story, so I'm extrapolating a little bit. I'm fan fictionalizing a tiny little bit, but let's say that in Scrooge's post story life, it is said he knew how to keep Christmas, and he integrated into the community. He spent time with people. He was connected. He made relationships. He became very generous, so he's giving his money to a lot of people. But let's presume for a moment that he maybe continued to live simply, frugally. No reason not to. One can be wealthy and frugal and responsible and still be generous, still be connected. So assuming that that's kind of the direction he went, still living kind of simply, um, within his means, and feasting on Christmas. But let's presume he's still being kind of simple the rest of his life. We could say there's something more closely resembling an ascetic practice, an actual healthy ascetic practice there, and that one is now living simply, maybe not living to accumulate wealth or living to hoard wealth, but living to give, living to be generous, living to be connected, living to celebrate with people who are celebrating, mourn with people who are mourning, being part of life, but still refraining from excess pleasures and frivolities and refraining from waste, refraining from indulgence. Something like that would now be more like a healthy ascetic practice and could actually be very healthy. And there could be a lot of character growth that goes in that. Uh, what continues to be missing in Scrooge's life in the story world is, he's not part of the church. He's not part of a tradition that way, for as far as we can tell, and that's not written into his character arc that he pursues that. He doesn't quite hit ascetic level he doesn't quite hit the monastic level, but we could presume that with his character change, he does begin to be able to healthily do what a good ascetic practice would be like. And it's something that is actually more possible, more attainable for your average person as well. Most of us are not going to be monks or nuns. That's not for everybody. Not everybody should try to do that. Some people can, and that's great. But like me, I mean, I romanticize that lifestyle a lot, but I have a wife and kids in the business, so I'm very much in the world right now. I can't be an ascetic at a monastic level, but there is a level of asceticism that I could still practice, in that I could still refrain from a certain level of indulgence, a certain level of frivolity. I could still live simply. I could still be very generous. I could still practice fasting and almsgiving and renunciation of certain pleasures, or very carefully controlled experience of certain pleasures. That does become very possible. So there's a related concept that can be built into this as well, and we do sort of see this in Scrooge's arc and how it goes, and it's the balance between feasting and fasting. Uh, so this is a thing that shows up a lot in the Orthodox tradition. We have our fast days. Every Wednesday and Friday. There's Great Lent. There's Nativity fast. There's the Apostles' fast. There's the Dormition fast. And so, and these are days where, we refrain from certain foods. It's just part of our ritual. Almsgiving is a part of what we do. There's an aspect of monasticism that hits all of us. So there's a presence of fasting, of going without, of living very simply. And then there's feasting. We have our feast days. We have our 12 major feasts. And, we just celebrated Nativity, and that's, a 40-day fast. It's a mild one compared to Great Lent, but, it's a 40-day fast that accumulates in. Here's this long all-night vigil, great feast. We bring back the meat and the cheese and the wine, we party all night. And then the week following is a fast-free week, where it's meant to be hey, let's celebrate. Let's eat, let's drink, let's be together, let's be merry. And then the week after that, we're back in rhythm of, we do our fasting on fasting days, et cetera, et cetera. And I think this is really healthy, especially considering how a recovery rhythm goes. We'll talk about, well, there's going to be people who enter a recovery process who are going to lean toward excess, lean toward feasting a little too much, lean toward the overindulgence, the chaotic overconsumption, the compulsion toward experiencing things. Some people are going to lean that way, and it's going to be work for them to tone it back, to refrain, and to abstain, at all, or to a healthy degree. But then you also get people on the other end who are able to begin abstinence from stuff really, really quickly, really easily. And they can quickly quit the drugs. They can quickly quit the alcohol. It might take them a little bit longer for the weed, but they do it. They quit the porn. They quit the gambling. They maybe stop watching TV. Maybe they also stop eating meat. Maybe they pick up an exercise routine. They live really simply, and they push themselves to be really strict all of the time. And the challenge with that, although it's very socially acceptable and very laudable within recovery circles, it's not true recovery because it's imbalanced. It's only the fasting. And what tends to happen is that breaks at some point. People can't sustain that. You can't sustain a life of perpetual abstinence from everything. And like the saints and the monastic people who do that, they're rare. They're very special. Also, they're part of a tradition. Also, they're part of a community. Also, they have a very clear sense of the spiritual gain that comes from it. So there's a very specific lifestyle structure in which that can be done well, and that's just not, that doesn't exist outside the church, and it doesn't. I would say it doesn't even exist in a lot of recovery culture. Uh, there's a lot of ritual and structure in recovery culture, but not that much. So so then what becomes necessary is to have a cycle of fasting and feasting, of having a plan for it. There's going to be some times when I'm really strict with myself, and then that will be marked by certain other periods when I can be lax with myself. Not in every way, and it's not of complete indulgence. It's not an abandoning of all structure. It's controlled, and it's specific. Like one wouldn't say, I'm gonna, fast from methamphetamines until, every third Sunday, and then I'm gonna go on a bender. Not quite like that. It's more of like, I'm going to maybe renounce, you know, drugs and weed altogether, maybe alcohol too, and then practice some manner of fasting with food also. But then on certain days, I will feast. I will enjoy these experiences. And this is really apparent with food. I think it shows up very well here, where I might be really strict with myself, maybe like mostly vegan, very simple, most days, but like, one day in 7, or once a month, or something. I will be able to look forward to a feast, an enjoyment of the riches of the good earth that God has given us. Um, all that to say, there's a lot we could say about this, and I'm saying a lot, but the idea is that there ought to be this cycle of fasting and feasting. Of I get strict with myself, and then I am a little bit looser with myself, and I stay in that rhythm. And because I stay in that rhythm, my appetites grow, but then they're met, but not overindulged, so they don't turn and control me. And I get to just have this more balanced life. And especially if I'm doing this in community and I'm connected with people, there's a balance there. And as I'm thinking again about here's this character, this Ebenezer Scrooge character, it seems like his life begins to be something like that, where yeah, again, presumably he continues to live simply, live frugally, be very smart with his money, but then he keeps Christmas, and he sure keeps Christmas, and nobody keeps Christmas like him. And there's feasting and singing and laughter and merriment. Um, and maybe some other days of the year too. Like, he doesn't live every day that way, because you couldn't live every day that way. You shouldn't live every day as if it was like the Christmas feast. Um, but on Christmas Day, you should feast like it's Christmas, or whatever your holiday happens to be. But yeah, there's something really cool in how I know he's a cool depiction of, I think, what a really important principle is for how to live, how to rejoice, to fast on fast days, to live simply, to mind our own business, to work with our hands, to go without, to forego some pleasures, uh, but then on feast days, to be with people, to be joyful, to fill ourselves, to enjoy the blessings and the good pleasures that God has given us. Again, in a balance, always in a balance. So anyway, uh, you didn't think there was so much in the story. Actually, probably you did, because you're probably a very smart reader. But so I'm gonna put this one up both on my story podcast and on my recovery podcast, because I think there's some cool crossover components. It's a really great story with some really great characters to really think about, really ponder. And there's some really interesting recovery principles, or recovery life principles, to consider also in this wonderful little story from long ago. So all that to say, I would highly recommend the reading of A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. It's not a very long story. If you're reading with kids, it can span a couple weeks of broken into chunks, or if you're on your own, it could be like a long night. Have a glass of hot cocoa to go with it, and yeah, it's a really great story. So thank you for joining me this evening to consider the story and consider my rambles. on the story. If you like this sort of discussion, please join my community, my podcasting community for the story podcast for the Word and Journey. You can visit patreon.com/MosesBernabe and become a supporter there. Or if you're coming at this from the recovery mental health counseling side, you can go to patreon.com/outer circle. You can join the community there. Either way, I'd love to have you along for the ride, for the discussions. Leave me your comments, leave me your questions, and I will look forward to connecting with you at some point soon. And to invoke the marvelous Tiny Tim, God bless us, everyone.